Music. Picture 300 grand estates, all clustered in a single district, each owned by millionaires. Brush Park wasn't merely affluent, it was iconic. Folks dubbed it the Petite Paris of the Midwest. Back in the 1880s, this Detroit enclave boasted some of the priciest properties across the U.S. Designers from every corner of the globe flocked here to craft stunning edifices. Elm trees shaded the avenues, lawns were immaculate, each residence felt like a royal domain. Then, it vanished entirely. Come the 1980s, Brush Park lay in ruins, charred shells of mansions, windows sealed with plywood, roads dominated by gangs. Out of those 300 lavish dwellings, perhaps a handful endured. The others? Torn down, forsaken, crumbling in place. Most folks reckon they grasped the cause. Cars, they claim. White exodus. Detroit crumbled, dragging the area down too. Yet those are mere surface issues. The true tale runs deeper, more calculated, and far more ruinous than the average person realizes. This is the account of how the nation's most splendid district was methodically dismantled. Not through mishap or solely market pressures, but via targeted decisions from particular individuals. And how, defying all expectations, a handful of holdouts are reviving it. Before we plunge ahead, leave a note down there. Visited Detroit? What's your take on what befell spots like Brush Park? If tales of ascent, decline, and revival in U.S. urban areas captivate you, hit subscribe and thumbs up on this clip. Your backing fuels these in-depth explorations. All right, let's rewind to the 1850s, when Brush Park was simply farmland, and one fellow sparked a vision that would transform Detroit for good, the district that defies death. Here's the puzzle. Brush Park possessed every edge an area could desire. Ideal spot, near central Detroit, yet distant enough for serene lanes and fresh breezes, stunning surroundings, boulevards flanked by trees, generous parcels, affluent dwellers with boundless funds, architectural gems meant to be cherished and safeguarded. Comparable elite zones from that period thrived. Boston's Beacon Hill retains its elite status. Chicago's Gold Coast stayed intact. San Francisco's Nob Hill weathered quakes and downturns while keeping its riches. Right in Detroit, enclaves like Indian Village and Palmer Woods held onto their vibe and home prices. So what doomed Brush Park? Stroll the remnants now, and you'll spot the specters. The Ransom Gillis House, a Gothic revival showpiece with spires and intricate masonry, stood vacant for years. Its ceiling caved in, insides ravaged by elements and intruders. It's refurbished these days, though scarcely. For each structure rescued, 10 more have disappeared, utterly vanished, not adapted for new purposes, not reused, bulldozed, wiped clean. The vacant plots scream the narrative more than the remnants. Where the George Jerome House rose, a bowed front gem blending Eastlake touches on its limestone exterior. Now, zilch. Just turf, perhaps asphalt for cars. The base erased, the rock carted off or interred, as though it never graced the earth. Envision the magnitude, 300 estates. This wasn't scattered opulence for a few tycoons amid a sprawling metropolis. It was dense fortune, row upon row, forging a community without parallel in the States. Plots were vast, twin-sized ones were routine. Homes tailored by famed builders. Cash flowed freely since owners swam in wealth. Elisha Taylor, a top-tier lawyer nationwide, erected a Gothic revival abode on a double parcel. In his twilight years, he donned formal wear and a silk hat, strolling the blocks. Local kids would guide him back, honoring him as cherished nobility. That dwelling? Lost. James Campbell raised an elegant pad that seemed modest next to its flashy piers, which still made it a mansion. Vanished. Albert Eugene Fay White's Italianate villa on a choice corner, complete with horse ties and flawlessly tended yards. Gone. Gradually, these design wonders faded away, not across ages, but in mere decades. The downfall struck swiftly, harshly, and without mercy. By the 1950s, the place was beyond recognition. By the 1980s, a battlefield. Yet what renders this especially heartbreaking? Brush Park perished while Detroit still prospered. The decline started in the 1920s, amid the city's surge as auto industry's hub. Estates turned into rooming houses even as Henry Ford forged the working class. That's the enigma. This wasn't a zone slain by its hometown's fiscal woes. The sequence doesn't align. Brush Park fell ahead. Long before Detroit's famed woes, alternative forces struck, several, in fact, conspiring to shatter what seemed eternal. The standard account? Autos let folks. Relocating to the suburbs seems like an overly straightforward explanation. Sure, that shift occurred, but it took place across the entire country, and many affluent city districts managed to adjust. They transformed grand estates into multi-unit dwellings or commercial spaces. They drew in fresh inhabitants. They evolved yet persisted. Brush Park, however, failed to adjust. It crumbled entirely. Why is that? The notion of white flight following the 1967 riots feels simplistic too. Those disturbances undoubtedly hastened the desertion, but they don't account for the area's decline starting 4 decades prior. The unrest hit in 1967, yet the opulent residences were already turning into rooming houses by the 1920s. So what doomed Brush Park from 1900 to 1967? Moreover, blaming Detroit's overall economic downfall doesn't hold up. The city declared bankruptcy in 2013. By 1980, Brush Park was already in ruins. The urban decay followed the district's downfall rather than preceding it. Then, what's the true cause? How could Brush Park perish despite possessing every asset and incentive for endurance? Why did 300 lavish estates disappear from this single area while other prosperous zones adapted and thrived? The explanation isn't straightforward. It's not a single factor. Rather, it's a mix of location, financial pressures, racial prejudices, flawed city planning, and intentional decisions that gradually dismantled the community over many years. Grasping the true story of Brush Park's fate reveals key insights into the successes and shortcomings of U.S. cities. To get there, though, we must first grasp what Brush Park represented during its height. Without appreciating the splendor that vanished, the devastation of its end loses its impact. The era when Detroit rivaled Paris as America's gem. Music, 1850. Detroit surges ahead. The population swells rapidly with waves of immigrants arriving in pursuit of prospects. Building projects never cease. Fresh structures, residences, and public works spring up everywhere. What began as a humble port on the Great Lakes evolves into a manufacturing giant. Yet, rapid expansion brings challenges. The central business district grows overcrowded, chaotic, and polluted. Industrial sites spew fumes. Avenues teem with activity. The prosperous folks who had erected cozy abodes close to the heart of town now seek refuge. They crave roominess, tranquility, fresh air while staying near their downtown enterprises. That's the moment Edmund Brush spots a chance. His father, Elijah Brush, served as Detroit's second mayor. In 1806, when the settlement was little more than a wild outpost, Elijah acquired an elongated, slender parcel right beyond the urban boundary. He turned it into a family homestead, fertile soil, near enough for vending crops, yet distant enough for serenity. By the 1850s, that distance had shrunk to the city's growing fringe. Standing on his inherited acreage, Edmund Brush envisioned tomorrow. Farming here wouldn't last. Urban sprawl approached inevitably, so he would steer that growth. He aimed to craft not merely a district, but a meticulously designed enclave for Detroit's upper crust. His vision was groundbreaking for 1850s America. Broad boulevards, much wider than standard urban paths, shaded by rows of elms, spacious parcels with strict minimum dimensions permitting only grand dwellings, no humble cottages, no shops, no blended developments. This would remain exclusively residential, exclusively luxurious, exclusively elegant. He named it Brush Park and promoted it with flair. It wasn't mere property on offer. It signified entry into Detroit's premier circle. Purchasing a plot in Brush Park proclaimed your status among the elite. The affluent jumped at it right away. Parcels vanished fast. And the purchasers weren't only wealthy, they were driven. Each sought to outshine the next door with their home. Rivalry elevated designs to unprecedented levels. Designers poured into Detroit. Some hailed from the East Coast, schooled in New York or Boston, importing refined Eastern aesthetics. Others arrived from abroad, German artisans, Italian masons, French stylists. Brush Park turned into a global display of design prowess. What emerged was a delightful jumble of styles. No residence resembled another. Every estate was bespoke, tailored to the proprietor's preferences and highlighting the creator's expertise. Gothic Revival estates with steep arches and intricate carvings neighbored Italianate villas boasting spires and expansive overhangs. Queen Anne dwellings with spired corners and encircling verandas vied with Renaissance-inspired chateaux, displaying balanced fronts and timeless ornamentation. Second Empire abodes with sloped mansard attics flanked Romanesque fortresses featuring curved doorways and textured masonry. Such diversity could have spelled disorder. So much stylistic range risked clashing, yet remarkably, it harmonized. The generous roadways allowed each structure space to stand out. The ample grounds offered backdrop. The elm foliage tied it all together under a verdant veil. The outcome dazzled. A district where each street segment unveiled fresh sights and wonders. By the 1880s, Brush Park had earned its moniker as the Little Paris of the Midwest. And for good reason. The label wasn't an exaggeration. It truly competed with Europe's grand avenues in elegance and refinement. The area went beyond mere residences. Sacred structures emerged all around. Temple Bethel El, crafted from sturdy stone with commanding design that insisted on endurance, catered to the Jewish residents. The initial Presbyterian church loomed above, featuring Romanesque dimensions that overshadowed ordinary proportions. These weren't humble local chapels. They stood as bold declarations in architecture, engineered to endure for ages. Then there was Irving Elementary School, the esteemed academy where all Brush Park youngsters, irrespective of their families' faiths or origins, gathered to learn. It evolved into the area's central gathering spot, molding and mingling the upcoming leaders of Detroit's upper crust. By the 1890s, Brush Park had hit its height. More than 300 grand homes filled the district. No plot lay empty. Every dwelling housed a family. The avenues gleamed spotlessly. The inhabitants ranked among the nation's richest and most influential. Stroll along Alfred Street in 1890, and you'd witness a density of luxury unmatched in few spots. The wrought iron barriers kept in flawless condition, the grass trimmed by expert landscapers, the horse-drawn carts lined up curbside. Not ordinary ones, but bespoke carriages pricier than typical homes. Russell McClashlin spent his early years in Brush Park amid this prosperous era, studying at Irving Elementary and romping on those pristine roads. Years afterward, he penned recollections of his youth. On a warm summer night, no veranda sat empty. Those verandas wove all the locals into a tight bond, like one expansive, barrier-free parlor extending a quarter mile. That image highlights a key truth. This place transcended affluence. It formed a true fellowship. Folks recognized one another. Kids frolicked side by side. Households mingled on stoops each dusk, forging a broad kin-like network. Prior to ice cream vendors roaming, a fellow called D. Peters would croon along the lanes as his pony drew a popcorn cart. Local youth caught his tune and dashed out, clutching a penny, eager for hot popcorn. Basic joys, yet they reveal the district's essence. Secure, intertwined, buzzing with routine traditions. Brush Park's gentlemen weren't merely prosperous, they wielded influence. They directed the city's factories, financial institutions, and legal practices. Their choices impacted countless employees and vast fortunes. They embodied Michigan's pinnacle, and Brush Park served as their bastion. The ladies oversaw estates that operated like compact enterprises. A standard mansion demanded several staff members, housekeepers, chefs, groundskeepers, chauffeurs. Throwing soirees for 20 guests was commonplace, overseeing the event schedule, upholding protocols, embodying the household and social circle. It demanded constant effort. This marked the summit, Brush Park at its utmost glory, around 1890 to 1900. A district that appeared everlasting, impervious, fated to shine as Detroit's gem for eras. Every resident there assumed it would persist indefinitely. The dwellings were constructed for longevity. The fortunes looked boundless. The societal framework seemed timeless. This embodied the established hierarchy, the thriving ascending, erecting splendid creations, nurturing lasting bonds. They erred. In just 20 years, the downfall commenced. In 50 years, the area would transform beyond recognition. In a century, it lay in wreckage. Yet the Standard accounts for that downfall. Cars, suburban exodus, Detroit's financial woes fail to capture the full picture. They overlook why Brush Park perished while others endured. They concealed the true causes behind the deliberate dismantling of this apparently unbreakable enclave. To grasp that, we must scrutinize the myths widely accepted about the demise of Millionaire'S Row. The myth universally held. Query anyone on Brush Park's fate, and the response echoes the same. The car? It appears reasonable. Henry Ford's production methods transformed mobility. The Model T brought vehicles within middle-class reach. Abruptly, folks could reside distant from jobs. Suburbs boomed. Affluent clans forsook city palaces for expansive properties in spots like Grosse Pointe and Bloomfield Hills. Brush Park vacated as all motored off. Neat, tidy, inaccurate. Indeed, cars altered living patterns nationwide, yet most upscale city districts adjusted. They didn't crumble. They shifted. So what prevented Brush Park? Consider Boston's Beacon Hill. Comparable period, akin elite dwellers. As cars emerged, certain households relocated outward, but many remained, or fresh prosperous ones arrived. The neighborhood adapted smooth, certainly. While some grand homes in the area turned into apartment buildings or office spaces, the prestige endured. Even now, Beacon Hill ranks among the priciest enclaves in the U.S. Cars didn't wipe it out. Chicago's Gold Coast stays affluent and esteemed. Vehicles failed to ruin it. New York's Upper East Side continues to flourish. Automobiles didn't clear it out. Right in Detroit, various upscale districts weathered the rise of cars. Indian Village, only a short drive from Brush Park, held onto its elegance. Palmer Woods preserved its essence. Boston Edison retained its affluent dwellers. All these Detroit spots endured the very same shift in transportation that allegedly doomed Brush Park. They made it through. Several are booming these days. Thus, cars alone can't account for everything. Sure, they played a role, but another factor left Brush Park especially exposed. Consider the chronology. The Model T debuted in 1908. Ford's assembly line kicked off in 1913. Widespread car ownership took hold in the 1920s. If vehicles caused Brush Park's downfall, we'd see the slide begin roughly between 1920 and 1930. And yes, it faltered then, yet not due to the elite bolting for suburban havens. They had already departed. The stately homes were already shifting to rooming houses by 1920. The downturn kicked in sooner, prior to the surge in car ownership. Another trigger sparked the unraveling, with autos merely speeding it up. Now, regarding vehicles' true impact, they offered the affluent choices that previously didn't exist. Back in 1900, a top Detroit executive needed to reside fairly near the city center, home to their workplace. A horse-drawn buggy had its limits. Brush Park fit the bill ideally, near enough for a quick trip, distant enough for peace and room. Come 1920, thanks to cars, those spatial equations shifted. You could reside 10 miles away and hit downtown in just 20 minutes. Overnight, Brush Park's spot, once ideal, turned simply sufficient. Why stick with a half-acre parcel there when you could claim 5 acres in Grosse Pointe, complete with waterfront? But that reasoning hit every city district. Cars opened up suburbs across the board. Still, just certain urban areas crumbled while others evolved. Vehicles created chances to depart, but didn't force anyone out. Folks in Beacon Hill could have split. They owned cars. They could afford countryside manners. Plenty chose to remain, as the area kept its appeal. It delivered perks that suburbs lacked: easy walking, vibrant culture, nearness to city perks, timeless buildings, a tight-knit vibe. Brush Park boasted those too. Timeless buildings? Absolutely. 300 gems. Tight-knit vibe? Yes. Generations of elite families connected. Nearness to downtown? Undeniably. Superior to most spots. Then why the mass exodus? Because an element eroded Brush Park's allure. A shift occurred that pushed the wealthy to escape. It rendered the place off-putting, inhospitable, done for. Cars supplied the exit strategy. But another force provided the urge. Observe what befell the mansions once the rich vacated. They didn't linger vacant. They weren't razed right away. Instead, they morphed into rooming houses, multi-unit rentals, bargain digs for laborers. By 1920, all the opulent homes on Alfred Street had transformed into boarding spots where plant workers grabbed cheap rooms. Ponder that. These weren't forsaken shells awaiting elite buyers. They swiftly repurposed for blue-collar lodging. Demand for shelter in Brush Park persisted, only not from the upper crust. The area's position stayed handy for those toiling in Detroit's plants. The big houses, carved into tiny spaces, could cram in scores of workers affordably. Thus, the issue wasn't the spot, nor the closeness to employment. It centered on the area's vibe, the caliber of residents, the trajectory of transformation. An element deterred the wealthy from lingering, despite the practical location and stunning design. Cars handed them a getaway path, yet they were running away from an issue, not merely chasing a lure. And that issue went beyond suburbs being appealing. It ran deeper, more unsettling, and far more intentionally crafted than a basic tale of transit innovation. The car narrative feels easy, impersonal, mere tech evolution reshaping lifestyles. No one's to blame, nothing dark. But such tidy accounts often miss the mark. Cars didn't end Brush Park. They served as the escape vehicle for those evading something worse. And that leads to the next myth folks accept. White flight doomed the place. This one carries more validity, yet it's still incorrect on the chronology, mistaken about the triggers, and off base regarding accountability. The next myth claims that white exodus doomed it. The 1967 Detroit uprising lasted 5 days, claiming 43 lives, wounding thousands, and leaving whole districts in ashes. It's among the gravest chapters in U.S. city chronicles, with lasting scars on Detroit that can't be ignored. Post-1967, white families vacated the urban core en masse. The populace plummeted. Revenue streams dried up, public amenities withered. The metropolis spiraled into a long-term downturn that's only recently eased. Folks often point to Brush Park as a victim of this exodus. The unrest drove off potential funders from the area. The chaos proved Detroit too risky for affluent dwellers. Leftover buildings sat empty, got trashed, and fell apart. Come the 1980s, Brush Park resembled a barren zone. Sounds plausible, doesn't it? The uprising sealed its fate. Not quite. Examine the sequence of events. The violence erupted in 1967. Yet Brush Park had essentially expired well beforehand. Those grand homes shifted to rooming houses back in the 1920s, 4 full decades prior. Decay set in during the 1930s and 1940s. By the 1950s, the bulk were badly deteriorated. The 1967 events didn't dispatch Brush Park. They merely hastened the end for a district already on life support. That said, this doesn't downplay the 1967 catastrophe. The uprising sharply hastened Detroit's overall slide. It sparked a huge exodus that crippled the city. Still, it fails to account for Brush Park's downfall, since the area was crumbling well before 1967. Now, consider the actual white exodus, the earlier one, overlooked because it's subtler and more awkward to confront. Brush Park's founding inhabitants were mostly white Protestants. This exclusion was deliberate. Binding covenants and quiet pacts barred Jews, Catholics, and especially African Americans. Such tactics were commonplace in elite U.S. enclaves back then. Prejudiced, sure, but it fostered a sense of uniformity for those inside. Similar backgrounds, tight-knit circles, a unified vibe. During the 1910s and 1920s, Detroit's African American community surged. The Great Migration drew hundreds of thousands northward from the South, chasing work in the thriving auto plants. The black population swelled by 600% from 1910 to 1930. Housing was scarce, and they were confined to select zones through official rules and unofficial threats. Brush Park bordered several of these allotted areas, not smack in the middle, but near enough to blur the lines, near enough for black households eyeing upgrades to eye those stately homes, particularly as they morphed into multi-unit setups. The affluent white occupants viewed this shift in makeup with dread. Their gated haven faced an incursion, in their bigoted words. Home prices would tank, lawlessness would rise, kids would face peril. All the era's prejudices flared up, so they bolted. Not drawn by suburbia's allure alone, not just the ease of car travel. They fled the evolving demographics. They escaped mingling, or the mere threat of it. This is the white exodus that doomed Brush Park, not the flashy 1967 edition. Recall the gradual, calculated, biased desertion of the 1920s and 1930s. The elite white homeowners could have held on. The framework remained solid. The estates retained their elegance. The spot stayed practical. But they opted out rather than share space with black neighbors. And this went beyond personal relocations. It was orchestrated. Realtors engaged in racial steering whites to outer developments and blacks to approved pockets. Lenders marked Brush Park as off-limits, denying loans to prospective owners. Insurers hiked premiums or denied policies outright. The whole real estate system conspired to block fresh upscale influxes. Those homes turned into boarding houses not due to lack of interest from the rich, but because white elites were funneled elsewhere, and black elites were barred by rules and norms alike. By 1930, Brush Park had turned into what city planners term a transitional zone, euphemism for a once white space opening to black entry. In 1930s America, that label spelled doom for real estate appeal and funding. Lenders wouldn't touch it, insurers bailed, no prosperous household would invest. The area's fate was sealed before World War II kicked off. So indeed, white flight destroyed Brush Park, but it was the version from the 1920s. The decline in the 1920s and 1930s stemmed from racial bias and unfair loan practices, rather than the 1967 unrest that prompted an exodus. Yet this account falls short, as it fails to address why the grand homes weren't maintained, why they weren't repurposed, or why demolition overtook adaptation. While prejudice accounts for why affluent white families departed, it doesn't fully account for the outright ruin of the structures. Numerous districts underwent shifts in population and endured. In Harlem, elegant row houses shifted from prosperous white owners to equally affluent black ones. In Brooklyn, similar residences exchanged owners, but stayed physically whole. Even Detroit saw certain areas navigate population changes without sacrificing their homes. Brush Park didn't merely evolve demographically, it faced total physical obliteration. Of the original 300 mansions, the vast majority have vanished. They're not simply inhabited by new folks, they've been wiped out entirely. And bias by itself doesn't justify the wrecking. Neglect tied to economic downturns doesn't summon heavy machinery. A different factor was at play, one more purposeful and intentional. Individuals actively chose paths that led to the building's demolition. Those choices weren't dictated by escaping locals or evolving demographics. Instead, they came from urban designers, road planners, and officials who eyed Brush Park and deemed it unworthy of preservation. That's the true culprit behind Brush Park's downfall. Not cars offering a quick getaway, not solely prejudice pushing people out. The core issue lies in Detroit's calculated actions, policy choices, infrastructure spending, and city planning focuses that methodically raise the area. And these actions carry identifiers. They bear timestamps. They leave documented records. Brush Park's erasure wasn't some fluke or unavoidable outcome of market pressures. It was orchestrated, bankrolled, and carried out by those convinced they were forging Detroit's tomorrow by tearing down its history. The spot no one desired. What rarely gets discussed is this. Brush Park suffered from a positional flaw right from its inception, though it took years for the issue to surface. In the 1850s, when Edmund Brush laid out the district, he selected terrain ideally suited for the era, near the city core, handy for commerce, yet removed enough to allow expansive properties. It represented the ideal spot for mid-19th century Detroit. But urban areas expand, and with Detroit's growth, Brush Park's prime positioning turned into a liability. Consider a 1900 map of Detroit. Brush Park lies directly north of the central area, roughly a mile from the heart. Southward stretches the bustling commercial zone, growing more factory-filled. East and west lie blue-collar areas encircling the plants. Northward opens undeveloped space destined for suburbs. Brush Park ended up hemmed in. It lacked riverfront appeal, that top-tier land along the Detroit River reserved for the elite's grand estates. Nor was it sufficiently northward to qualify as suburban. It occupied that awkward middle ground, and middle ground spots proved disastrous for upscale enclaves. Contrast it with Grosse Pointe. As prosperous Detroit residents began abandoning Brush Park, where did they head? Grosse Pointe, with its shoreline on Lake St. Clair, about 5 miles east of the center. They sought not only larger parcels but superior settings featuring water views, scenic allure, and separation from the grimy factories. Or take Bloomfield Hills, 15 miles north, with its hilly countryside, ponds, and woods. Relocating to Bloomfield Hills meant entering a wholly new environment, not merely distancing from the city, but embracing true countryside, openness, and isolation. Brush Park simply couldn't measure up to such alternatives. As cars rendered them reachable, Brush Park's edges eroded. You couldn't install a waterfront there. You couldn't shift it away from the factories. You couldn't alter its core layout. And that closeness to industry grew ever more burdensome. Detroit's plants weren't tidy or serene. They roared, belched smoke, and spewed filth. The atmosphere around the industrial zones was appalling. Coal haze, toxic vapors, metallic particles. The din never ceased, machines humming around the clock, locomotive signals, plant alerts. By 1920, Brush Park no longer served as an oasis from city chaos. It was engulfed by it. The downtown, once a mile distant, had inched nearer. Factory zones had sprawled outward. The serene avenues and fresh air that Edmund Brush had envisioned were now tainted. Not obliterated, but certainly diminished. Affluent dwellers took note. Why endure Brush Park's urban encroachment when Grosse Pointe offered Morning Lake winds? Why endure plant emissions when Bloomfield Hills provided woodland freshness? The positioning that seemed flawless in 1850 felt tolerable by 1920 and intolerable by 1930. But the key insight here is that this positional drawback didn't need to doom the district, many city neighborhoods near industry. Other districts proved resilient by evolving to meet new demands. Unable to lure the super-rich, they drew in affluent professionals or shifted toward business operations or transformed into vibrant art zones. Urban areas evolve constantly. Districts transform, yet they aren't doomed to vanish. Brush Park might have evolved into a hub of condos for emerging executives. Those grand estates could have been repurposed as workspaces for attorneys and physicians. Its positioning was ideal for such shifts, proximate to the city core, accessible and housed in stunning heritage structures. Yet that evolution stalled. The reason? Detroit blocked it. Or, to be precise, Detroit deliberately obstructed it via zoning regulations, public works funding, and redevelopment strategies that rendered Brush Park's reinvention unfeasible. The site's challenges left Brush Park exposed. However, it was the municipal handling of that exposure that ultimately doomed the area. And that handling carried a specific label: urban renewal. Detroit prioritized vehicles above residents. The 1950s and 1960s marked America's peak of urban renewal efforts. Municipalities nationwide razed rundown sections and substituted them with expressways, vast parking areas, and contemporary complexes. The rationale held that aging, rundown edifices impeded progress. Raise them, begin anew, design for the car-dominated era. Detroit pursued urban renewal with exceptional zeal. As the global hub of auto manufacturing, vehicles defined Detroit's character, its livelihood, its prospects. Thus, when national interstate funding emerged, the city's strategists had a clear agenda: construct expressways enabling drivers to skirt the urban heart altogether, residing in outlying areas and passing through Detroit en route without pausing. Such expressways demanded pathways across the city, and the most affordable, straightforward routes traversed sections with falling real estate worth, areas such as Brush Park. The Chrysler Freeway, I-375, took shape in the 1950s. Its path sliced right along Brush Park's southern boundary. Scores of opulent homes lay in its trajectory. The authorities' solution: raze them. No efforts to safeguard, shift, or detour around them, just demolition. The stated basis was that these counted as deteriorated assets, and indeed, by the 1950s, numerous had fallen into disrepair. Years of neglected upkeep, shifts to rooming facilities, waning capital inflows, the estates had lost their luster. Still, deteriorated served as a handy designation. It empowered officials to seize lands via eminent domain, offer scant payouts, and level sites amid minimal backlash. But these weren't ordinary structures. They represented architectural gems, unique artistry, enduring icons, and the city regarded them as mere barriers to roadway building. The Chrysler Freeway wasn't the sole initiative that ravaged Brush Park. The expansion of Woodward Avenue, Detroit's primary north-south artery, ballooned it into a broad corridor geared for rapid vehicular flow. That broadening necessitated tearing down structures along its borders, additional estates erased, and the toll extended past outright highway clearances. These undertakings rendered the district inherently uninhabitable. Picture attempting to sustain an elegant living enclave with an elevated interstate plunging through its midst. The clamor, the fumes, the eyesore of towering slabs, the severance where nearby roads no longer linked due to the barrier. Officials didn't merely claim a handful of edifices, they shattered the area's unity. Brush Park shifted from a cohesive, pedestrian-friendly haven to a disjointed array of parcels divided by transport barriers. Strolling its full length became impossible. Crossing overpasses, adapting to altered flows, coping with sections now isolated from neighbors, all became the norm. And the damage went further. Urban renewal encompassed more than roadways. It included purging, quote 1, clearing out what authorities viewed as inadequate dwellings to make way for fresh constructions. Brush Park, featuring its weathered estates turned into lodgings, stood out as a key candidate. Officials seized whole swaths, razed multiple structures at once, left behind expansive barren parcels meant to draw fresh builds, and then zilch. Why would anyone pour resources into a zone the city had branded as rundown, now encircled by speedways and stripped of its legacy appeal? Those voids lingered empty for years. No progress materialized. Officials had wrecked the district under the guise of rescue, yielding neither preserved heritage nor incoming capital. Just emptiness. Yet this still falls short of accounting for Brush Park's complete downfall, since certain edifices endured the roadways. Some segments dodged the renewal bulldozers. Nevertheless, those survivors decayed. Those structures declined as well. The whole area fell apart, extending beyond just the sections that got torn down. What stopped individual owners from keeping the remaining properties in shape? Why was there no funding for renovations or new uses? Why did the neglect become complete instead of spotty? The key factor was that fixing things up just wasn't financially feasible anymore. The properties had turned into money pits that no one could break free from. No one had the resources to rescue them. Picture yourself as the owner of a grand house in Brush Park back in 1960. Perhaps it came to you through family inheritance, or maybe you snapped it up at a bargain in the 1940s, dreaming of a makeover. Either way, you're holding a 50-room Victorian Gothic estate that's gone without real upkeep for 4 decades. What choices do you have? First possibility, bring it back to its former splendor. Start with a new roof. That alone runs at least $100,000 in as $1960 or around $1 million in today's terms. Overhaul the wiring across all 50 rooms since codes demand it, and the old setup is a serious fire risk. Modernize the pipes, fix any sinking in the foundation, swap out the windows, sand and seal the floors, patch up the plaster everywhere. All told, you're staring at $500,000 in 1960 money, which equals about $5 million now. And once it's done, you'd own a stunningly revived mansion in a fading district. It wouldn't come close to valuing at your investment level. Second idea, transform it into rental units. In other urban areas, this paid off. Old estates turned into apartment buildings, with steady rents covering the upkeep. But not in Brush Park. The place was beyond saving. Rental rates were rock bottom. No one was lining up to live in apartments there. You'd pour hundreds of thousands into the changes and never see your money back. Third route, repurpose for business like offices or shops, yet Brush Park sat amid empty lots and sputtering commercial zones. Companies steered clear. The overhaul expenses would be massive, especially with stricter commercial regulations, leaving you with unused space in an area devoid of foot traffic. Fourth choice, offload it. To who? There's no market for sprawling 50-room homes in sinking areas. Even landing a purchaser, the sale price would be negligible. Land values had dropped to nothing. The municipality's policies had essentially written off the district. The structures themselves carried a negative worth. They drained cash just to hold or remove. You couldn't even donate them. Fifth option, let it go. Quit the tax payments, halt all care, just leave. Wait for the authorities to claim it over unpaid dues. That's the path most proprietors took in the end, as it was the sole sensible financial move. Keeping up the property bled funds without any payoff. Wrecking it also cost a bundle. But bailing out? That was free. As a result, Brush Park became littered with forsaken edifices, not from heartless neglect but from being cornered. These were bottomless financial voids. Any cash poured in vanished without a trace. The smart play was to walk away. And once that began, it snowballed. A derelict neighbor drags down your own property's appeal. Why sink money into fixes when the adjacent one is crumbling? Why chase renters when the block is full of shuttered facades? Neglect fed on itself in a vicious cycle that devoured the community. The local government offered no support. Taxes on these oversized homes were hefty, calculated from their initial scale and parcels, ignoring their diminished worth. Folks trying to hold on dealt with steep levies on incomeless holdings. It was less painful to forfeit and face seizure than to keep funding dead weight plus teardown fees. Even razing proved too pricey. Dismantling a 50-room behemoth demands tens of thousands. With no buyers for the empty lot, and Brush Park land sat unsold, it's pure waste. That's why the buildings lingered in decay. Knocking them down didn't add up economically. Officials could have stepped in, offering restoration incentives, cheap loans for revamps, zoning tweaks for fresh purposes, or preservation zones that boost values via heritage safeguards. Plenty of other towns pulled this off and preserved their vintage districts. Detroit went the other way. Through freeway builds, slum clearance, teardowns, and infrastructure oversight, the administration rendered any revival unviable. Then, it pointed fingers at owners for ignoring upkeep on assets that were inescapable burdens. By the 1970s, Brush Park had become a barren economic wasteland. Profitable fixes were out of reach, cheap demolitions weren't possible, sales were a non-starter. All that remained was desertion. And that's precisely what happened, structure by structure, until the district resembled a field of wreckage. This explains Brush Park's downfall, not cars, not suburban exodus, a TRA devastating urban disaster, a spot that lost its appeal as Detroit expanded. Intentional demolition via city planning that favored roadways at the expense of communities, alongside economic pressures that rendered upkeep unfeasible and desertion unavoidable. Those 300-grand residences didn't simply vanish. They were methodically razed by municipal decisions, forsaken amid fiscal ruin, and allowed to crumble since rehabilitation offered no viable return in the environment Detroit fostered. Yet what's truly striking is that certain structures endured regardless. Defying all financial logic, bucking staggering probabilities, enduring years of neglect and deterioration, about a dozen estates in Brush Park held firm. Grasping how precisely those edifices persisted and the efforts required to rescue them sheds light on key insights into safeguarding heritage, fiscal realities, and the capacity of dedicated people to resist systemic breakdowns. The enduring ones, estates barely hanging on. From the 300 initial mansions in Brush Park, around 12 made it to 2,000 in somewhat intact shape, just 12. That equates to a 96% demolition rate. However, those 12 holdouts are intriguing since they highlight the conditions needed to weather Detroit's downfall. What allowed these particular structures to persist while adjacent ones did not? The Ransom Gillis House stands as the best-known holdout. Constructed in 1876, it represents a Gothic revival gem, featuring limestone facades, intricate stone details, a turret with Gothic arches, the sort of edifice that belongs in a storybook. It endured thanks to a single element, its position, positioned on a prominent corner parcel, prominently displayed on a stretch not fully ravaged. Prominence played a key role. Structures tucked away on inner lots where traffic ceased decayed out of sight. But the Ransom Gillis House overlooked a somewhat bustling avenue. Folks noticed it, and from time to time, an individual stepped in to block its teardown. This isn't true safeguarding, though. For years, the Ransom Gillis House lingered as wreckage. Parts of the roof caved, permitting water to flood inside. Plaster interiors tumbled, wooden floors decayed. Intruders shattered all panes and scrawled over surfaces with spray paint. By 2000, labeling it a structure felt kind. It was merely a hollow frame, yet an upright one, surpassing most Brush Park estates. The Stimson House persisted for other motives. Erected in 1888, it embodies Romanesque revival grandeur with curved arches and ornate masonry. It lasted because somebody consistently covered the taxes. Over eras of downturn, amid shifts in proprietors and stretches of emptiness, entities like trustees, descendants, or corporate holders ensured the land taxes were settled, averting municipal takeover and possible razing. The edifice decayed, no doubt, but it stayed under private title, thus dodging urgent peril. Land taxes might seem trivial. Far from it. Numerous forsaken Brush Park properties fell to city control once taxes lapsed. Under city possession, they turned into burdens. The municipality faced choices, upkeep or removal, with removal being the more affordable option. Steady private holding, even by those unable to fund repairs, acted as a shield against teardown. Authorities couldn't arbitrarily dismantle owned properties without justification. The Rizzio House outlasted via resilient building techniques. Completed in 1874, it showcases Second Empire design with its signature mansard rooftop. Second Empire constructions boast sturdy builds, hefty stone barriers, firm bases, premium components. The Rizzio House weathered like all else in Brush Park, but it did so gradually. The barriers stayed erect. The base endured. Lacking any care, the structure's fundamental strength persisted. In theory, revival was possible for whoever possessed the funds and drive. Additional holdouts shared comparable tales, prominent corner placements that retained notice, proprietors who upheld tax obligations, builds so durable they withstood prolonged disregard, yet reaching 2000 intact differed from genuine rescue. These were derelicts. Revival expenses could run millions each. The area remained hazardous, gripped by poverty. No investors queued to invest fortunes in reviving estates amid Detroit's roughest district. The holdouts barely existed, bereft of prospects. At least, that's how it appeared. Then, around the mid-2000s, shifts occurred. Subtly, not overnight. Detroit didn't instantly thrive. Brush Park didn't abruptly attract. Still, developments emerged that opened doors for conservation. Initially, Detroit's officials conceded that permitting heritage sites to fester constituted flawed governance. In 2005, the city committed resources to shore up select remaining Brush Park estates. Not full revival, merely stabilization, installing interim coverings, securing openings adequately, reinforcing unstable barriers. The outlay was limited, perhaps thousands per site, yet it warded off collapse and extended their lifespan. Next, advocates for heritage pushed the notion that Brush Park's remnants possessed worth as the structures were preserved as evocative ruins rather than lavish restorations, since full rehab proved far too costly. These edifices chronicled Detroit's saga, ascent, decline, and eventual desertion. That narrative carried real weight. Perhaps the properties could be shored up in their ruined state, highlighted for visitors, and monetized via heritage tourism instead of converting them into homes. Even more crucially, a handful of dedicated folks resolved to safeguard these landmarks irrespective of fiscal viability. Not for profit, restoration simply didn't add up financially, but because the edifices held intrinsic value, embodying skilled artistry, heritage, and Detroit's bygone splendor. Erasing them would amount to erasing the city's soul. One such advocate was Nicole Curtis, a passionate do-it-yourselfer and historic conservationist known for her series Rehab Addict. She had built her reputation rehabbing vintage residences in Minneapolis. Then Brush Park caught her eye. Images of the Ransom Gillis house, that stunning Gothic revival gem now crumbling into decay, convinced her it deserved rescue. Skeptics dismissed her as delusional. The structure was beyond salvage. The area posed grave risks. Expenses would skyrocket. She'd never break even. Revival seemed unattainable. Undeterred, she pressed on. And the developments that followed reshaped Brush Park's future in astonishing ways. The series that transformed it all. In 2013, Nicole Curtis acquired the Ransom Gillis house for $16,000. At first glance, that sum seems like a steal for such a grand estate, until you behold what it actually secured. a heap of weathered limestone and decaying timber, barely bound by optimism and innate design brilliance. The roof had vanished almost entirely. Torrential rains had infiltrated for generations, ravaging the contents beneath. Inside lay devastation, fallen ceilings, decayed flooring, shattered steps. Not a single pane remained intact. Doors had disappeared. Looters had pilfered every scrap of worth. Only the skeleton endured, the stone exterior, the base, the outline of its form, and scarcely more. Curtis chronicled the revival process through her program, Rehab Addict. Every installment revealed the harsh truths of reviving a 19th-century wreck. This bore no resemblance to glossy HGTV tales resolved in half an hour. It demanded years of labor, vast sums of money, endless obstacles, and triumphs gained by mere fractions. Sourcing artisans skilled in recreating 1876-era masonry proved a daunting quest. Matching the authentic limestone involved steep costs and challenges. Navigating municipal approvals, checks, and regulations unprepared for Gothic estate revivals turned into a procedural ordeal. Yet Curtis endured. She sought donations. She captured each phase on film. She illuminated not only the structure's rebirth, but Brush Park's legacy, its peak era, downfall, and forsaken years. She ignited public interest in a site long overlooked by most in Detroit. Vital, too, she embedded herself locally. While the project lagged months or years behind, Curtis resided in Brush Park. She strolled its blocks. She connected with holdouts, the sparse dwellers who had weathered the long slide. She portrayed Brush Park as more than wreckage, a resilient pocket community, diminished yet enduring. The overhaul spanned years. Curtis endured relentless backlash. Accusations flew that she was displacing locals. Detractors argued she favored opulent estates over accessible dwellings. Her motives, they claimed, stemmed from chasing viewership, not true stewardship. Some points rang true. Revival raises tough choices. Still, Curtis achieved the improbable. She rescued the ransomed Gillis house. By 2017, it stood renewed. Not flawlessly. Trade-offs were inevitable and not wholly finished. Certain indoor tasks lingered, but the edifice endured. The covering was secure. Glass filled the frames. Masonry got mended. One could traverse it and envision its former magnificence, its potential revival. Then, an unforeseen shift occurred. Eyes turned toward it. Developers, conservation advocates, designers, they began viewing Brush Park anew. If the ransomed Gillis house could emerge from oblivion, perhaps others might follow. If Curtis had pulled off the feat, financially, logistically, structurally, then revival held promise after all. Additional sites drew focus. The Stimson house attracted a purchaser committed to its overhaul. Other dilapidated spots received bolstering, then slow reconstruction. Modest builds began emerging, not supplanting the grand homes, but populating vacant parcels with dwellings that harmonized with the vintage architecture. Curtis's endeavor sparked momentum. Not through simplicity, it was grueling, nor profitability, which likely eluded it, but by validating that safeguarding was feasible. It illustrated that sharing these structures' tales could foster attachment. It revealed Brush Park's capacity to transcend decay. Her program achieved another key feat, enlightening audiences on conservation. Installments delved into design jargon, building methods, and period backdrop. Audiences discovered understanding why these structures were significant, what set them apart, and the value in protecting them. That awareness fostered a dedicated support base for conservation efforts. Viewers nationwide developed an affinity for Brush Park after encountering its narrative on screen. Did the program alone rescue Brush Park? Hardly. The area's revival stemmed from various influences, including municipal policy reforms, economic growth initiatives, and population changes. Yet Curtis's widely publicized and meticulously recorded renovation altered the storyline. Brush Park evolved from a desolate wasteland into a promising site for renewal. Such a change in viewpoint proved pivotal. By 2020, numerous structures in Brush Park underwent refurbishment. Fresh builds occupied empty parcels featuring row homes, condos, and hybrid commercial residential projects. The district was undergoing another metamorphosis. After 8 decades, it finally witnessed growth instead of deterioration. However, this is where the narrative turns intricate. Revival raises fresh dilemmas. For whose benefit is Brush Park being preserved? The emerging projects aren't budget-friendly dwellings. The refurbished grand homes aren't intended for the laboring households that once occupied them as rooming facilities. The area is being reconstructed to attract affluent inhabitants, the very group that abandoned it back in the 1920s. Does this constitute fairness, true safeguarding, or merely yet another round of exclusion where lower-income folks are ousted as the district regains worth? Such inquiries lack straightforward resolutions, yet they define Brush Park's current challenges as its dilapidated remnants gradually yield to novel forms. Millionaires. Row in the present day. Does this truly signal a return to glory? Position yourself at the intersection of Alfred Street and Woodward Avenue now, and you'll observe a community in flux. Cranes punctuate the horizon, sleek contemporary row houses, boasting expansive panes and minimalist aesthetics. Neighbor-revived Victorian estates, sites barren for half a century now buzz with groundwork. Brush Park is under reconstruction, but for whom and in what form? The latest ventures come at a premium. Row houses fetch $400,000 or more, well out of reach for most locals in Detroit. When the revived estates are offered for sale instead of personal use, they command comparable sums or adapt into upscale professional quarters. Brush Park is reclaiming its affluent status. This ought to be encouraging, no? The sector that crumbled is finding salvation. The estates that decayed over generations are regaining life. Funds are pouring in. Land costs are climbing. Brush Park is rebounding. But rebounding into what? The initial Brush Park was elite and divided, crafted for Detroit's elite while marginalizing others. As it crumbled, blue-collar families, often African-American, settled into the rooming houses and endured for years. When the area depopulated, a handful of dwellers hung on, nurturing vitality in Brush Park amid its darkest periods. Today, those holdouts are facing eviction. With escalating land prices, veteran occupants struggle with spiking leases or assessments. They're being sidelined by the very renewal they outlasted. The emerging Brush Park is erected atop their legacy, their bonds, their enduring resolve. This embodies gentrification's harsh paradox. The district advances, yet those who sustained it through adversity miss out on the gains. They're supplanted by arrivals who can meet the elevated costs. Advocates for heritage protection confront thorny issues. Certainly, rescuing architectural landmarks counts. But for whose sake? If revival equates to uprooting, does conservation justify it? If options pit rundown affordable units against lavish restored abodes, which betters Detroit? No tidy conclusions exist. One might contend that safeguarding generates employment, boosts municipal income, draws visitors, benefits extending citywide. One could claim that permitting landmarks to decay helps no one, whereas revival safeguards shared cultural legacy. These points hold weight, but counter-arguments persist. Detroit boasts ample unused terrain for fresh builds, and raising one of the rare enduring enclaves from the city's downfall merely to revive estates for affluent outsiders feels inequitable. That stance carries validity as well. Evidently, Brush Park's revival defies simplicity. It's not pure triumph. It's nuanced progress, beneficial for heritage, dubious for fairness, reshaping the area's essence. As of 2024, Brush Park counts about 50 inhabited structures, including 12 revived landmark estates and 38 modern additions. That's 50 where only 5 stood in 2000. Residency is growing for the first time in 8 decades. Business ventures are resurfacing, cafes, eateries, boutique enterprises. The district operates once more, though distinct from its 1890 or 1950 incarnations. It's not solely housing-focused. It blends commerce on lower levels with residences above. It's not wholly vintage. Fresh builds construction takes precedence in numbers here. It doesn't come cheap either. Costs mirror Brush Park's closeness to the city center and its rich heritage. Authorities have marked Brush Park as a heritage zone, offering safeguards for the remaining edifices. Tearing down structures demands permission. Fresh builds need to harmonize with the old ones. Such regulations safeguard the area's essence, yet they drive up expenses and restrict options. The main uncertainty isn't if Brush Park endures, it surely will. Far too much funding is poured in to allow further decline. Rather, the puzzle is what form Brush Park will take next. Will it evolve into a showcase of revived grand homes, an upscale pocket isolated from nearby areas, or a diverse blend that merges upkeep with accessibility? That outcome remains in flux. One thing stands clear. Brush Park's downfall could have been avoided. The loss of 300 opulent residences stemmed not from rising car culture, racial exodus, or unavoidable downturns. Instead, it arose from targeted decisions like road projects, city revitalization efforts, land use rules, and discriminatory lending practices that methodically eroded a community under the guise of rescuing Detroit. Brush Park's revival proves that safeguarding heritage works when financial incentives match governmental resolve. Curtis's refurbishment proved it doable. Investor enthusiasm supplied the funds. Municipal guidelines set the stage. Combined, they achieved what looked unattainable back in 2000. Yet this revival also highlights the boundaries of conservation. Rescuing architecture doesn't inherently aid those seeking shelter. Heritage efforts can sideline folks just as renewal schemes once raised blocks. Today's Brush Park dazzles in design and buzzes with commerce, but it stays out of reach for most locals. Thus, is this truly a revival? In part, yes. In part, no. The structures are rebounding. Capital is flowing back. However, the residents who weathered Brush Park's darkest times aren't returning. They're being pushed out by the renewal they helped spark. That's the nuanced reality of Brush Park now. 300 grand homes fell to intentional governance moves. 12 endured via chance and tenacity. The district rebuilds today, yet for newcomers with fresh agendas, yielding a transformed space. Brush Park crumbled because Detroit favored expressways over legacy, vehicles over bonds, growth over guardianship. It rebounds today as those values evolve. Conservation now holds economic, cultural, and civic worth. Still, worth and equity differ sharply. Brush Park gets rescued, but is the rescue thoughtful, equitable, driven by sound motives? Those issues linger unresolved. Their resolutions will shape not only Brush Park's path, but also if Detroit's heritage work benefits all or merely the privileged. 300 mansions, 100 years of rise, ruin, and gradual renewal. That's Millionaire's Rose Tale, the authentic one. Music.